Now let's have our third topic, which is the density-based methods. So, density-based clustering. This refers to one of the most popular unsupervised learning methodologies used in model building and machine learning algorithms. The data points in the region is separated by two clusters of low point density are considered as noise. The surroundings with a radius E of a given object are known as the E neighborhood of the object. If the E-neighborhood of the object comprises at least a minimum number mean points of objects, then it is called a core object. The key idea is that for each point of a cluster, the neighborhood of a given radius has to contain at least a minimum number of points. Here we have our database 1 and database 2. DBS scan algorithm. It is based on this intuitive notion of clusters and noise. The key idea is that for each point of a cluster, the neighborhood of a given radius has to contain at least a minimum number of points. Now, why DBSCAN or DBSCAN? So, partitioning methods, k-means and PAM clustering, and hierarchical clustering work for finding spherical shaped clusters or convex clusters. In other words, they are suitable only for compact and well-separated clusters. Moreover, they are also severely affected by the presence of noise and outliers in the data. Here, DB-scan algorithm requires two parameters. First, we have the EPS. So it defines the neighborhood around the data point, i.e., if the distance between 2 points is lower or equal to EPS, then they are considered as neighbors. If the EPS value is chosen too small, then large part of the data will be considered as outliers. If it is chosen very large, then the clusters will merge and majority of the data points will be in the same clusters. One way to find the EPS value is based on the k-distance graph. Next is the mean points and mean PTS. Minimum number of neighbors, data points within EPS radius. Larger the dataset, the larger the value of mean points must be chosen. As a general rule, the minimum points can be driven from the number of dimensions d in the datasets as mean points greater than or equal to d plus 1. The minimum value of mean points must be chosen at least 3. Here in this algorithm, we have three types of data point. First is the core point, second is the border point, and the third is the noise or outlier. So for the core point, it is a point, or a point is a core point if it has more than mean points within EPS, while border point, a point which has fewer than mean points within EPS but it is in the neighborhood of a core point. And lastly, the noise or outlier, a point which is not a core point or border point. DB-scan algorithm can be abstracted in the following steps. First, find all the neighbor points within EPS and identify the core points or visited with more than mean points neighbors. Second is for each core point, if it is not ready, cation. Second, for each core point, if it is not already assigned to a cluster, create a new cluster. Next is to find recursively all its density connected points and assign them to the same cluster as the core point. A core point A and B are said to be density connected if there exists a point C which has a sufficient number of points in its neighbors and both the points A and B are within the EPS distance. This is a chaining process. So if B is neighbor to C, C is neighbor of D is neighbor of E, which in turn is neighbor of A, implies that B is neighbor of A. Lastly is iterate through the remaining revisited points in the datasets. those points that do not belong to any cluster or noise. Here we have the optics clustering. It stands for ordering points to identify cluster structure. It draws inspiration from the dbScan clustering algorithm. It adds two or more terms to the concept of dbScan clustering. They are the core distance and reachability distance. So for the core distance, it is the minimum value of radius required to classify a given point as a core point. If the given point is not a core point, then its core distance is unidentified. Reachability distance. It is defined with respect to another data point q, or let q. The reachability distance between a point P and Q is the maximum of the core distance of P and the Euclidean distance, or some other distance metric, between P and Q. Note that the reachability distance is not defined if Q is not a core point. This clustering technique is different from other clustering techniques in the sense that this technique does not explicitly segment the data into clusters. Instead, it produces a visualization of reachability distances and uses this visualization to cluster the data. Moving on to our next topic, which is the grid-based methods. Grid-based clustering methods use a multi-resolution grid data structure. It quantizes the object areas into a finite number of cells that form a grid structure on which all of the operations for clustering are implemented. The benefit of the method is its quick processing time, which is generally independent of the number of data objects, is still independent on only the multiple cells in each dimension in the quantized space. The grid-based clustering uses a multi-resolution grid data structure and uses dense grid cells to form clusters. There are several interesting methods: ARIS, Thing, Wave Cluster, and CLI. Now let's talk about this thing. So, a statistical information grid approach. The spatial area is split into rectangular cells. There are various levels of cells corresponding to different methods of resolution. Each cell at a high level is separated into multiple smaller cells in the next lower level. Statistical data of each cell is computed and stored beforehand and can answer queries. The specification of higher-level cells can be simply computed from the specification of lower cells. Count, mean, S, mean, and maximum. Type of distribution, normal, uniform, and etc. The statistical information grid-based approach, or STING, follows a hierarchical approach to divide the spatial area into rectangular cells similar to a quad tree. The spatial database is scanned once and statistical parameters are determined for each cell. This STING technique can be viewed as a type of hierarchical approach. This step is to make a hierarchical description. The created trees separately divides the area into quadrants. So here is this STING algorithm. First is to determine a layer to begin with. Next is for each cell of this layer, we calculate the confidence interval or estimated range of probability that this cell is relevant to the query. Next is to, from the interval calculate above, we label the cell as relevant or not relevant. The fourth one is, if this is the bottom layer, then end the process. And the last one is, we go down to hierarchy structure by one level. Go to step 2 for those levels that form the relevant cells of the higher level layer. So this is the hierarchy diagram of STING. Next, we have the wave cluster. Is a multi-resolution clustering algorithm that first summarizes the records by imposing a multidimensional grid architecture onto the data space. It can use a wavelet transformation to change the original feature space, finding dense domains in the transformed space. So in this method, each grid cell summarizes the data of a group of points that map into the cell. This summary data generally fit into the main memory for use by the multi-resolution wavelet transform and the subsequent cluster analysis. A wavelength transform is a signal processing approach that decomposes a signal into a multiple frequency subbands. The wavelet model can be used to d-dimensional signals by using a one-dimensional wavelet transform d times. In applying a wavelet transform, data can be changed to preserve the relative distance among objects at several levels of resolution. This enables the natural clusters in the data to become more detectable. Clusters can be recognized by searching for dense areas in the new domain. Input parameters: no grid cells for each dimension and the wavelet, and the number of applications of wavelet transform. How to apply a wavelet transform to find clusters. It summarizes the data by imposing a multidimensional grid structure onto data space. And next, this multidimensional spatial data objects are represented in an n-dimensional feature space. Now apply wavelet transform on feature space to find the dense regions in the feature space. Then apply wavelet transform multiple times, which results in clusters at different scales from fine to coarse. Why is wavelet transformation useful for clustering? First is, it uses a hat-shaped filters to emphasize region where points cluster, but simultaneously to suppress weaker information in their boundary. Next, it is an effective removal method for outliers. Also, it is of multi-resolution method and it is cost efficient. Next topic, we have the clique. So it is based on automatically identifying the subspaces of high-dimensional data space that allow better clustering than original space. So clique can be considered as both density-based and grid-based. It partitions each dimension into the same number of equal length intervals. It partitions an m-dimensional data space into non-overlapping rectangular units. A unit is dense if the fraction of the total data points contained in the unit exceeds the input model parameter. A cluster is a maximal set of connected dense units within a subspace. So, identify clusters, determine dense units in all subspaces of interest, and determine connected dense units in all subspaces of interest. So generate minimal description of the clusters, determine maximal region that cover all cluster of connected dense units for each cluster, and determination of minimal cover for each cluster. So what are these advantages? It automatically finds subspaces of the highest dimensionality, such as the high-density clusters exist in those subspaces. Next is we have, it is insensitive to the order of records in input and does not presume some canonical data distribution. And it scales linearly with the size of input and has good scalability as the number of dimensions in the data increases. So, the disadvantages is that the accuracy of the clustering result may be degraded at the expense of the simplicity of the method.